Day 17, the exercise still remains the same. I need to read 2,000 words and then do the daily 60. However, I've done the daily 16 behind the scenes, but I want to use day 18, which is tomorrow, to do kind of like a research on how to answer questions spontaneously and how well to give opinions. But today we have our topic ready. Is discipline more important than motivation? So I read. If you ask me whether discipline is more important than motivation, I would probably say yes, but I don't think that's the complete answer. Motivation matters. I don't want to pretend that it doesn't. There are days when you genuinely feel energized by what you're doing, when the objective seems exciting, and when you can see the destination clearly enough that taking action requires almost no persuasion. On those days, discipline feels unnecessary. You don't need to force yourself to study when you're fascinated by the subject. You don't need to convince yourself to train when you're excited about getting stronger. You don't need an elaborate productivity system when you're genuinely interested in the work. Well, the problem is that those days are not reliable. And I think that's where discipline becomes more important. Motivation is emotional. Discipline is structural. Motivation says, I want to do this. Discipline says, I decided to do this. That distinction seems subtle, but I think it completely changes how you approach difficult goals. If I depend on motivation, then my behavior becomes contingent upon how I feel. If I wake up enthusiastic, I work. If I wake up tired, I postpone. If I feel confident, I exercise. If I feel insecure, I find something else to do. If the project feels exciting, I make progress. But if it becomes repetitive or frustrating, suddenly I have 10 other things that appear more important. That is not necessarily laziness. And the danger of depending on motivation is that motivation is capricious. It changes according to sleep, stress, environment, recent successes, recent failures, hormones, expectations, and sometimes absolutely nothing that you can identify. You can be tremendously ambitious on Monday and completely indifferent on on Thursday. So if your entire system depends upon maintaining the right emotional state, your system is inherently fragile. I think that's why people sometimes misunderstand the discipline. They imagine discipline as an almost brutal ability to force yourself to do the things you hate. They picture someone waking up at 5 in the morning, taking a cold shower, exercising for 2 hours, working for 12 hours, eating perfectly, and somehow never experiencing resistance. I don't think that's discipline. Real discipline is considerably less dramatic. It is the ability to continue behaving according to a decision after the emotional excitement surrounding that decision has disappeared. Think about learning a skill when you begin. Everything is interesting because everything is new. Your brain is constantly receiving feedback. You notice improvements quickly. You learn a new technique. You understand a new concept. You solve a problem that previously seemed impossible, and suddenly you feel competent. Then something changes. You become familiar with the fundamentals, progress slows, innovative disappears. The same exercise that was fascinating 3 weeks ago becomes repetitive. The same mistakes appear, the improvement becomes less visible, and eventually you encounter what I would call the plateau of boredom. This is where motivation becomes unreliable. You haven't necessarily stopped caring about the goal, you have simply stopped receiving enough immediate emotional reward from the process. And that distinction is incredibly important because sometimes the problem isn't that you no longer want the outcome. The problem is that you no longer enjoy the process required to reach it. Those are completely different problems. If I decide that I want to become an excellent speaker, for example, I might initially be excited about the transformation. I imagine speaking confidently, expressing complicated ideas clearly, having conversations without struggling to construct sentences, and being able to explain my thoughts without filling every sentences with verbal tics. That vision is motivating, but the actual work is less glamorous. I have to repeat sentences, I have to slow down, I have to notice how I pronounce certain words. I have to record myself sounding awkward. I have to listen to the recording and identify mistakes. I have to repeat the same exercise tomorrow. And the day after that, and eventually, I'll repeat that. And the day after that, and eventually, the novelty of improvement disappears. That's where discipline enters the conversation. Discipline allows you to continue practicing when the practice itself has become ordinary. And I think that is one of the most underappreciated characteristics of people who become exceptionally good at something. They are willing to tolerate repetition long after repetition becomes exciting. They understand something that impatient people often miss. Mastery is repetitive. There is no dramatic breakthrough every morning. Most progress is almost invisible. You perform an action, receive feedback, make slight adjustment, perform it again, and gradually it becomes less bad. Then you become competent. Then you become reliable. Eventually, perhaps you become excellent. From the outside, people often see the final result and describe it as talent. They don't see the thousands of incremental repetitions that made the result possible. This is why I think discipline is more important than motivation, but I also think discipline without motivation can become equally problematic. If you force yourself relentlessly towards a goal, you don't actually care about. I'm going to read that again. If you force yourself relentlessly towards a goal you don't actually care about, you may become extremely efficient at building a life you don't want. That is an important qualification. Discipline is not a substitute for direction. You can be disciplined and misguided. You can wake up early, work hard, maintain an immaculate schedule, and still be pursuing the wrong objective. So perhaps there's a better way to frame the relationship is this. Motivation helps you choose and initiate a direction. Discipline helps you continue in that direction after your feelings become unreliable. Motivation provides ignition, discipline provides propulsion, and I think that's a more accurate paradigm than the idea that one must completely replace the other. There's another reason I prefer discipline. It creates trust in yourself. That might sound abstract, but I think it is extremely practical. Every time you make a promise to yourself and keep it, you reinforce the belief that your intentions have consequences. You say, I'm going to study for 30 minutes, and you study for 30 minutes. You say, I'm going to train 4 times this week, and you show up 4 times. You say, I'm going to finish this project before I entertain myself, and you finish the project. These seems like small decisions. They aren't. They accumulate. And eventually you develop a different relationship with your own word. You stop negotiating with yourself over every uncomfortable task because you have evidence that your decisions are meaningful. The opposite can happen too. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you're going to do something and then don't do it, you begin teaching yourself that your intentions are negotiable. I'll start tomorrow. I'll do it later. I just need to rest today. It's not that important. One excuse doesn't matter. A pattern does. After enough repetition, procrastination stops feeling like a choice. It becomes an automatic response to discomfort. And I think that's one of the reasons discipline is difficult. You are not merely trying to complete the task in front of you, you are often trying to interrupt a behavioral pattern that has been reinforced for months or years. That requires patience. It also requires some intellectual honesty because sometimes we use the language of motivation to conceal the absence of structure. We say, I'm not just motivated, but what we sometimes mean is, I have no specific plan, or I made the task too difficult to begin, or I allowed distractions to remain permanently available, or I have attached so much pressure to the outcome that starting feels threatening. Those are different problems and they require different solutions. If the task is too large, make the first step smaller. If the environment is distracting, change the environment. If the objective is vague, define it. If you're exhausted, rest. If you're afraid of failing, acknowledge the fear rather than disguising it as laziness. Discipline should not mean ignoring reality. It should mean responding to reality without abandoning your larger intention. That's why I dislike the extreme version of productivity culture that treats every moment of rest as weakness. Human beings are not machines. There are days your body needs recovery. There are periods your priorities change. There are moments when continuing is genuinely irrational. A disciplined person needs enough discernment to distinguish discomfort from damage. Those two things can feel remarkably similar. Sometimes you need to push through resistance, sometimes you need to stop. The skill is knowing which situation you are in, and that is much more harder than simply following a rigid schedule. There is also a strange psychological phenomenon that occurs when you become dependent on motivation. You begin waiting for yourself to feel ready. You think, once I feel confident, I'll start. Once I have more energy, I'll work. Once I understand everything, I'll begin. Once I feel inspired, I'll create. But readiness is often an illusion. Action frequently precedes motivation rather than following it. You begin, then you become engaged, then you make progress, then progress creates satisfaction, then satisfaction creates more motivation. In other words, the sequence is sometimes the opposite of what we imagine. We think motivation, action, and progress. But very often, reality is action, progress, motivation. That is a powerful distinction because it means you don't necessarily have to manufacture the feeling before beginning. You can begin without it. You can begin badly. You can begin reluctantly. You can begin for 10 minutes, and once you begin, the psychological resistance often decreases. The task that seemed enormous from a distance becomes manageable once you're physically inside it. I think this is why small commitments are so effective. Saying, I'm going to work for 6 hours creates an enormous psychological burden. Saying, I'm going to work for 15 minutes without checking my phone is much more easier to accept. The object is not to trick yourself forever. The object is to reduce the friction between intention and action. Once action becomes easier, consistency becomes easier. Once consistency becomes easier, identity begins to change. You stop thinking, I'm trying to become disciplined. You start thinking, I'm someone who does what I said I would do. That is a much stronger position. Identity is powerful because behavior eventually becomes self reinforcing. If you see yourself as a person who exercises, skipping the gym becomes feel psychologically different from what it was before. If you see yourself as a writer, writing is no longer something you occasionally attempt, it becomes a part of what you do. If you see yourself as someone who communicates clearly, practicing articulation isn't an unusual activity, it's simply maintenance. This is where discipline becomes less about force and more about identity. The mature version of discipline is not constantly fighting yourself, it is gradually becoming the kind of person who no longer needs to fight yourself as often. And perhaps that is the most important point I would make. Discipline should eventually become boring. That sounds strange, but think about it. If every productive action requires an internal war, your system is inefficient. The goal is to reach a point where certain behaviors become normal enough that you don't need an emotional debate every time they occur. You brush your teeth without negotiating, shower without waiting for motivation, you eat because you are hungry, you go to work because that's what you do. The interesting question is whether you can extend that principle to the things that matter most. Can you make studying normal? Can you make exercise normal? Can you make reading normal? Can you make practicing your communication normal? Can you make difficult conversations normal? Not exciting, not dramatic, normal. Because when something becomes normal, consistency becomes much easier. And consistency more than intensity is what tends to produce extraordinary results. One extraordinary day rarely changes a person's life. 500 ordinary days might. That's why I would still choose discipline over motivation. Not because motivation is useless, but because motivation is temporary by nature. It rises and falls. It can initiate action, but it cannot be trusted to govern action indefinitely. Discipline is different. Discipline says, I may not feel like doing this today, but I have already decided that it matters. And there is something deeply liberating about that decision. You no longer have to interrogate your emotions every morning. You don't have to ask yourself whether you are inspired. You don't have to wait for confidence. You simply consult the decision. What did I decide? And then you act accordingly. Of course, that doesn't guarantee success. Discipline cannot eliminate bad luck, uncertainty, competition, even structural disadvantages or circumstances beyond your control. It would be naive to suggest otherwise, but discipline does something perhaps more valuable. It increases the probability that you will still be moving when circumstances changes. And over a sufficiently long period, that matters enormously. So if someone asks me, should I focus on becoming more motivated or more disciplined? I wouldn't tell him to eliminate motivation. I would tell them to stop treating motivation as a prerequisite for action, using motivation when it appears. Enjoy it. Let it make the work exciting, but don't build your life around its availability. Build around decisions, build around systems, build around repetition, build around the quiet confidence that comes from keeping promises to yourself. Because eventually the question stops being, how do I make myself want to do this? The better question becomes, what would I do if I had already decided? And then you do that. That to me is discipline. And if motivation happens to arrive along the way, let it come. But don't wait at the door for it. So that's pretty much it. That's roughly 2,000 words. Stressful, but this is what it is. That'll be all for today. I'm going to be sharing the research on what I'm trying to do to improve spontaneous speaking, because that's where I feel my current constraint is at. I can't seem to come up with an opinion. So, for instance, if someone asks me, what do you think about X or Y? If I find it difficult to find a point, because out of a multitude of choices in my brain just can't seem to settle for one point. And when it comes to questions that as such, you need to be decisive so that you can sound more credible and communicate effectively. So that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching to the end. If you watch to the end, drop in the comments biscuit so I know that you watch to the end. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.